Hello everybody, this is Dan here. I hope you've been enjoying the M.A.B.L.E event so far. For this one, before we start, I have a suggestion. Go ahead and pause this video and go and get yourself a cuppa, a tea, a coffee, maybe a muffin, or even a beer or a wine, or whatever takes your fancy. Then sit back and enjoy these tasters for several of our books. First, you're going to hear the opening chapter of Vanquished. It's book one in Alex Janaway's magnificent fantasy epic, End of Empire. You're going to love it. Following this, the opening chapters from the first two of the young adult fantasy Filey Chronicles from Blackwell, The Bridge and the Butterflies and The Five Feathers. Then we'll have a good laugh with a poem that gave Dale Neal's book of children's verses its title, My Socks Have Gone Bonkers. The illustrations in there are by our recently launched Mark Millicent. Marie Gameson comes next with chapter 1 of her compelling psychological page-turner, The Day Jack Sacked His Therapist. It's a real thinker, that one. This is followed by the opening chapter of John Scotcher's awesome World War I fantasy adventure, The Boy in Winter's Grasp. That's one of my favourites. And then we'll round off this collection with the opening to Sue Knight's chilling novelette that extrapolates society's addiction to consumerism till they dropped. And that one is read by Penny MacDonald, so that's a real beauty to end this short collection with. So enjoy, and thanks for all your support throughout M.A.B.L. so far. There's a few more days to go.
Vanquished by Alex Janaway, Book 1 of the End of Empire series. Chapter 1, The Last Night. Owen Durl stepped onto the launching platform. Set on the highest level of the roosting tower, it gave him a perfect view of the day turning to dusk. A few stars were already visible, bright white pinpricks that on any other night would have been a joy to look upon. The sky was covered with patches of oppressive grey-black clouds threatening heavy showers. The breeze would keep those clouds away from the city. It was just a pity plenty more were coming in from the high country, and they looked nastier. It would be touch and go whether the battle would be over before they hit. Owen turned his attention back to the matter in hand and made his way across the platform. "Arno," he murmured, "are you ready?" The young male eagle watched his approach and extended his wings, giving them a little stretch before settling down. Arno was still growing. Big enough to take his weight, but small enough to take only half the space of the platform, a rough semicircle some 15 feet at its widest point, and a similar depth. Owen put his foot into the stirrup and hauled himself into the saddle. Below him, Arno shifted restlessly. Owen knew the bird was eager to launch, to get into the air where he would feel free. Owen was less eager. He knew what this night meant. This late autumn evening on the edge of the Empire. He was in no mood to rush what were likely to be his last hours in this world. He was as scared now as he'd been on his first flight, as conscious of his own mortality as that day he'd first entrusted his life to Arno. Yet it didn't seem real, not possible that he and everyone else would soon be dead. Owen twisted his body and leaned forward, watching his fellow eagle riders busy themselves with their own mounts. He hoped they might look over. He wanted to wave at them, maybe hear them shout some words of encouragement. This might be the last chance to speak to someone human. He heard laughter in his head, a light feminine sound. Someone was pulsing to him, sending a message straight from their mind to his. "Are they ignoring you, Owen? You're practically falling off your saddle to get their attention." Owen recognised the voice and looked about, trying to spot the speaker. Maybe she was already airborne, watching him from the sky. "Down here." Owen looked down into the gap between him and the adjoining platform. Below, Jenna was looking up at him, a broad smile on her face. He felt blood rush to his cheeks, his forehead grow uncomfortably warm. Even in the dark, he couldn't hide the rush of embarrassment he always felt when someone called him out. And it had to be Gemma who did it. He often wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A lad barely grown into adulthood, a shock of red hair, green eyes, ruddy cheeks, and just the barest hint of stubble. Not exactly the image of a warrior born, or the finest example of an eagle rider from the highlands of the Tisan Empire. Whatever she saw, it wasn't going to be anywhere near what he saw in her. A proud, confident woman with sparkling brown eyes and braided chestnut hair pooling down her lithe body. "Sorry, I just wanted to say good luck," he pulsed back to her. "I know, Owen," she responded, her bright smile fading, her lips pursing into a tight line. She raised her hand. "Good luck. See you on the other side," she shouted up at him. Owen raised his hand in reply. "You too." He wished he had something else to say, but was grateful she'd given him that much. She nodded and looked away. Her eagle stretched its wings and in one powerful downstroke took to the air. Owen watched her head into the night and turn to her left, moving beneath his platform out of his line of vision. There was no reason to stay any longer. Owen swallowed and blew out a breath of air, trying to settle the fluttering in his stomach. "Time to get started," he said quietly, trying to exude a calm he did not feel. He settled himself into the saddle and reached down to gather in the two ends of the thick restraining belt that emerged from either side. He buckled the belt across the tops of his legs, making sure it was tight, but not too tight. It was easy to cut off the blood. He'd done it enough times to know better. He adjusted his position, leaning forwards and slipping his hands through the leather hoop straps on the pommel. Happy that he was secure, he said to Pulse, ordering Arno to launch. The eagle approached the edge of the platform, its claws digging into the crude wooden decking. Repeating the manner of Jenna's launch, Arno downstroked his wings, then once, twice more, and lifted off and away from the tower. Their brief climb became a swift tipping motion as Arno angled down to gain airspeed. Owen felt the familiar lurch of his stomach, that rush of excitement as he and his mount swept towards the onrushing roofs and spires of the city below. The city port of M.A.B.L.E, the last city of the Empire. Directly ahead, the paved square of the city council hall started to expand and fill his vision. He'd done this 1,000 times, swooping over canyons, off mountainsides and treacherous cliffs. Yet still he held tight to his pommel, hands crushing the reins within them. The custom-made saddle forced him to lie almost horizontally towards Arno's beak, quite unlike riding a horse. The lower profile gave the eagle more speed, reducing wind resistance, and he was glad of that. His legs tightened on either side of his thick cloth seat. He could feel powerful muscles move beneath him as the eagle angled its wings, caught the air currents, and flattened out into a glide. Not for the first time, he felt the launch tower had been built not quite tall enough. Full-grown eagles had little difficulty gaining the air, whilst Arno had to work that much harder. Owen breathed deep as the eagle began to beat his wings evenly, getting into his stride, using his speed and the thermals to keep them level. Owen loved flying with Arno. He trusted his eagle more than most of the folk he knew. He reached out and patted Arno's neck, feeling the thick feathers slip under his leather glove, smooth as running water. "Nice work, Arno, nice work," he said. The eagle gave a long, slow screech in reply to his words. Owen often swore he sensed amusement when Arno responded like that. His fellow riders would just scoff, reminding him that eagles were not known for their sense of humour. He bid his eagle turn widely so they could circle the tower as the other birds in the 6-strong squadron launched from the platforms that ringed the structure. Many of them had been hastily built to accommodate the other squadrons that had arrived in the city. The tower was only supposed to house one. It occurred to Owen that as one of the younger riders, he had been assigned one of the highest platforms. He spotted his leader, Kadan, take flight and quickly gain the updrafts. It was hardly a surprise, as his mount was so much bigger than Arno, with at least 6 feet extra wingspan. Owen had no doubt that Arno would grow larger, but for now, carrying a rider with growing of his own to do, the young predator was large enough. Owen felt Cadarn enter his mind after a gentle push. Where many others would force their way in with scant regard, he always knocked first. Their leader was good like that. He led like he flew, calm and level. Squadron, that's all of us away. Now get to your patrol sectors and keep a sharp eye. Remember, stay low. The light is good tonight. The other squadrons will stay higher and push out further. They'll keep the buzzers off our backs for as long as they can. If you spot the target, head for the tower and let them know. The rest of us will converge and try to give the target some top cover. Good luck. Owen pictured his direction of travel and pulsed the image to Arno. The eagle dipped into a gentle turn, curving away to the north. He could have pulled on the reins, but his father had counselled him against that. The gruff voice played in his mind. An eagle isn't a horse. Be gentle oft as you can be, else that beak of his will tear you open a little, just to remind you who's boss. Sound advice. His father had lost an eye to an irate eagle. Now the excitement of taking flight had faded, the task at hand forced its way back into his mind. There was a fight coming, and it was all he could do to keep himself from turning Arno and flying for cover. The trouble was, there was nowhere left to go. Nowhere left for anyone to run to. Owen felt another surge from the simmering pool of anger that lay beneath his immediate thoughts. It gave him energy and a desire to act. But there was nothing he could do except his duty. He had to keep a handle on it no matter how frustrated he felt, as it was liable to get him killed sooner than he expected. There were no choices left for him or any of his friends, or the others that were gathered around the city. The order to light the fire trench that circled the city waited upon the outcome of their mission. To those charged with its lighting, it mattered not whether they succeeded or failed. All that mattered to them was the timing. M.A.B.L.E rushed past beneath him as he winged northwards. No one travelled through the city, save for patrols coming to and from the walls and harbour, their torches often lost amidst the buildings. He had watched from the sky as the evacuation had been called 2 days earlier. Evacuation didn't feel like the right word. Expulsion felt more fitting. Most of those who lived in M.A.B.L.E had been forced from their homes and out into the hinterland about the walls. Only a few had been allowed to stay, and those had been escorted to the docks and wharves to board the waiting ships. What had shocked him was the lie that had been told, that the docks were too full, that people should move to the beaches to be collected. Thousands had left the city and joined the tens of thousands already encamped outside the walls. By the time they realised they were not going to be saved, it was too late. The gates were closed. The walls were manned with Tisan's soldiers, and nobody would be gaining entry, no matter the pleas for mercy. It didn't sit right with Owen, but what could he do? He couldn't go against the decisions of his church. They always knew best. They worked for the blessed emperor. At least, that was what they were all supposed to think. But Highlanders had always had an independent streak, a distrust of anyone that tried to impose too much control. Years of imperial rule had yet to breed that out of his people. On his left was the sea. Lights sparkled and shone upon the water, enough of them to rival the stars in the sky. He could not tell how many ships were out there, but it was a vast number. Everything still afloat within 100 miles had been gathered in and around M.A.B.L.E, waiting to collect their precious cargo before heading west. Beyond the walls and completely surrounding them was another sea of lights, a refugee camp the size of which Owen could scarce comprehend. A desperate press of humanity huddled around large bonfires with nowhere left to go. Owen felt a cold knot form in his stomach that had nothing to do with flying or the fear he felt for his own life. There were people down there, terrified and frightened, who'd done nothing wrong, unable to do anything but wait. They said it had been a nightmare back in the east, when the central cities of the empire fell, hemmed in on all sides and their populations slaughtered. He'd tried to imagine what it must have been like to be penned in with no room to manoeuvre, but he had no point of reference. Eagle riders lived their lives without boundaries or constraints. As they crossed the city wall, Owen looked down upon the rows of soldiers, city guards and militia. Their faces were a blur, their arms and armour indistinct, the glow of hundreds of fires, braziers and torches stretching away in a semicircle, trailing off along the entire stretch of the parapet and the 3 gatehouses. Beneath the wall ran the trench, filled with the carcasses of the warehouses, slums and homes that were closest to the walls. Beyond the city now they passed over scrubland, bare rocks and the woodlands further inland. He'd flown over this ground many times over the last 10 days, flown for miles, and none of the eagle riders had spotted their target. Their perimeter had shrunk further each day as the enemy drew near, content to command the skies and herd the Tisan stragglers towards M.A.B.L.E. On the shoreline north of the city, a stretch of shingle and coarse sands, he could see groups waiting as rowing boats and skiffs shuttled to and from the shore to the larger ships anchored further out to sea. It was clear that not all the fleet had listened to the church's orders to be selective of who they saved. The captains of those craft would know the enemy was almost upon them, even if those on the beach didn't. Good for them. At this stage, the most natural thing to do was to save as many as they could. It was the right thing to do. These folk weren't just Tisans, they were the last of humanity. He pulsed Arno lower so he could get a better view. There was still a semblance of order. He saw women and children being sent forward, their menfolk sacrificing themselves. How long before it fell apart? Stop worrying about things beyond your control and look for those damn buzzers, he chided himself. At least you could hear them coming. The noise of a buzzer, a single giant bee, was hard to disguise, let alone a swarm of them. But if you didn't hear them, then your eagle could spot them more than a mile off. The bird's sharp eyes had given them the initiative in countless skirmishes. Unless the buzzer was ridden by a sorcerer, those bastards could cast a spell to deaden the sound of the bee's wings, create illusions to hide their approach, and blast you out of the sky before you got close. Night was truly upon them now, and that complicated things. Eagles did not have good night vision. They were day hunters. But at least the buzzers were no better, and it would require their pilots to control them in any battle. In that respect, the eagle riders had an edge. The eagle and rider had a closer form of contact. He looked about, concentrating on the dark horizon, yet he saw nothing, just the black silhouettes of his fellows. He had to rely on them to keep his back safe. He switched to scanning the ground before him as Arno winged over the wide, dark forests that ringed M.A.B.L.E. He had to focus and stay alert. The existence of the Empire depended on it.
Hi, my name's Janet Blackwell, and I've written an exciting fantasy trilogy set on the Filey coastline entitled The Filey Chronicles. Today I'm going to be reading the first chapter from the first book in the series, which is called The Bridge and the Butterflies. She came to us at midnight in the back of a police van. I was in my room in the attic when she arrived, angry that I'd been made to stay in all night to wait for her. I'd missed Will's party. There was no way I was going downstairs to play Happy Families. The policewoman threw open the back doors of the van, and the next minute this girl was out on the street. If I hadn't been sulking, I might have felt sorry for her. It was obvious that the police were happy to get rid. Mum had said that she was about 14, the same age as me, but she looked a lot younger dressed like that. She was very small, and she had a long blonde plait right down to her waist. It was tied with a ribbon. I saw Mum rush out. I opened my window a little to try to hear what they were saying, hoping that there'd been a mistake and that the girl would be taken away. It didn't seem likely. Suddenly a firework exploded like a gunshot, and one of the policewomen strode off in the direction of the beach. The girl just stood there, shivering under the streetlight in a pair of pyjamas that were way too big for her. She was gripping a black bin bag as though she thought Mum was going to take it from her. I noticed she had no shoes on her feet. Just for a moment she glanced up. I thought that she'd seen me, but then I realised she was looking up at the sky and the fireworks being set off, probably from kids messing about on the sands. They'd be out celebrating the start of the summer holidays. Not like me. I couldn't stop thinking about the party at Will's. It all seemed so unfair. Mum had taken her cardigan off and put it around the girl's shoulders. They walked towards the house. I slammed my window shut. The girl wasn't my problem. Well, not then, anyhow. The 5 Feathers. Chapter 1. They were looking for something. That was all I knew for certain. A strange noise had woken me up in the night. I didn't know what time it was, but it was pitch black. I thought I'd been dreaming. I tried to reach for my phone, but for some reason I found I couldn't move at all. Before I could work out what was happening, there was a clattering sound. Something had fallen from my desk. I tried to push myself up again, but it was impossible. There was a terrible smell of dampness, mould, something rotting. It reminded me of the stench of the old lobster pots piled up at Bridlington Harbour. Now I could hear 2, maybe 3 voices whispering in the darkness, and I sensed they were angry, even though they spoke in a language I hadn't heard before. I must be still asleep, I thought. That's why I can't do anything. That's why I can't cry out for help. Things on my desk were being touched by them. Papers were being scattered. The metal box I kept my beach treasures in was tipped over. My drawers were emptied out onto the floor. One of them edged nearer to me, but I couldn't move. There was the shock of someone's hot breath on my face, the foul odour of dead things. Then I heard the click of its teeth. A white light flashed across the bed, and just for a moment I caught a glimpse of the creature by my side. Long, straggly black hair, sharp features, yellow eyes. "Where is it?" it whispered. A pain seared through my head, and I knew it was trying to get into my mind, to find what it was looking for. Then, I don't remember the rest. When I next opened my eyes, light was streaming in through the gap in the curtains. Nothing on my desk appeared to have been moved. I shivered. It must have been another dream. There was a cold wind blowing across the room, and I leapt out of bed to close a window I didn't remember opening. A grey December day in Bridlington. I went to pick up my uniform from the chair, and that's when I saw it. A large letter W had been scratched onto my wardrobe door.
My Socks Have Gone Bonkers by Neal. This is the verse that gave its name to the book. My socks have gone bonkers, completely insane. They went for a walk on their own in the rain. They marched through the door while soaking wet through, leaving marks on the floor in a size 42. My socks have gone loco. I'm feeling quite vexed. I really don't know what they're going to do next. One of them grooves while another starts prancing. I've not seen these moves on Strictly Come Dancing. I bought them on eBay, a tenner a pack. They've all gone astray and I can't get them back. I knew from the moment they leapt out of the box that these really were the most wayward of socks. One's in the drawer, one's in the latrine. There's 2 or 3 more in the washing machine. One's in the shed, one's under my bed. There's one in the bread bin and one on my head. My socks have gone crackers like crispy Rivitas, like my Uncle Peter's unhinged odour eaters. They rode the Big Dipper with my Auntie Pippa's flibbity-gibbety monster feet slippers. My socks have gone bonkers. I'm getting the blues. They jived on YouTube to 1 million views. My socks have gone bonkers. It's really bad news. And between you and me, so have my shoes. The Day Jack Sacked His Therapist by Marie Gameson. Prologue, 1981. Jack? No answer, of course, little pest. Jill marched around the cemetery looking for her 7-year-old brother, who had a habit of wriggling out of view whenever the grip on his bony shoulder was released. Their father sat on a bench nearby, smoking tobacco, either lost in refreshed grief or lost in the pleasure of smoking on a sunny Sunday morning when the corpses beneath his feet had been forced to give up forever. Jill finally found Jack, kneeling in front of a headstone, chatting away to it. She was about to shout at him for kneeling on a dead person, but he looked so entranced that curiosity made her creep forward. With his fair head bowed inches from the gravestone, he was stroking it, running the fingers of one hand gently over a bumpy, worn face carved into the stone. As she got near enough to see what he was stroking, she involuntarily made an "ugh" sound, whereupon Jack's lips stopped moving and he withdrew his hand from the image. It was a man's face drowning in leaves, with what looked like branches sticking out of his mouth and nose. Whatever it was, Jill thought it was wrong. "What are you doing?" she demanded, and Jack did his normal infuriating shrug. "Well, get up." As soon as Jack had raised himself, she grabbed his collar and pushed him at a sharp angle, this way and that through East London's good and dead, until she found the right grave. "Now don't go off again," she told him. "It took me ages to find Mum." Jill stared solemnly at the black headstone, which read simply, "In loving memory of Doris Hurst, who was taken from us 1st of August 1978. "Now we should say a prayer," said Jill. She didn't actually know any prayers, but she moved her lips silently and hoped the sadness of the occasion would get through to Jack. But with one half-opened eye, Jill could see that the brat was already sneaking sideways looks at adjacent headstones and comparing them with their mothers. "Who brings her these?" Jack asked. There was a collection of fresh yellow and white-petalled blooms on her grave, and Jack must have guessed that their father was not the sort to pick flowers. Jill was about to tell him off for interrupting her prayer, but then realised that the question was useful. "I don't know who, Jack. There are many people who were very upset when Mum died." "Who?" asked Jack, his light blue eyes big and, to Jill's annoyance, quite free of tears. "Well, us, of course. And Mum had sisters. Maybe one of them brought the flowers." "Oh." And his head was already turning, looking for some new distraction. Jill was beginning to grasp how behaviour worked. She was reading quite a bit on it, though it was often difficult to understand the books she was getting out of the library. But she now understood why her father had thrown himself into frantic, manic DIY activities after their mother had died. And she also knew why Jack was still incapable of behaving like a normal little boy who had done something wrong. It was refused pain. Jill took the back of Jack's head and swivelled it so that he faced their mother's headstone. Then she bent down to speak quietly in his ear. "The important thing, Jack, is that nobody blames you." The Boy in Winter's Grasp by John Scotcher. Chapter 1. The Master of Crag Top. Albert hated Friday mornings. It wasn't that his paper round was any harder, and he didn't spend any more time tramping over the wet Derbyshire moors, though the winter chill seemed particularly harsh this morning. It had been getting steadily worse all December. That was nothing compared to the clutching in his stomach. Friday was the day that he delivered the papers to Cragtop. Albert's round was long. Sometimes, if he was lucky, his father, who owned the general store, took pity on him and ordered his brother to help. On those days he could be finished in time to get to Mrs. Lane's reading lessons in the church school. Even on the slowest rounds, when he dangled his 11-year-old legs into the brook for an hour, or took a mug of tea with Thomas the shepherd, he'd still be back in time to join his friends on the school wall at break time. There they would talk in excited voices about the war, how they would join up and beat their way to Germany. "We'll teach the Kaiser," his friend Harry had said yesterday, then gone on to tell the boys exactly how. Mrs. Lane eventually came out to see what all the laughing had been about, scolding them and telling them they sounded like monkeys. Albert hadn't been laughing, though. He'd already realised that Friday was just round the corner and his feet felt like lead weights. Now Friday was here. He just wanted it to be over. He took his bag, pulled his coat over his thick jumper and crashed out into the winter morning. He sped through the first part of the round, pushing papers with careless determination through people's doors, his feet turning before the flaps snapped shut. When the bag was empty, he raced back to the shop, trying not to think too much. It was only when he found himself staring at the irregular pile of papers for Cragtop House that his butterflies returned. Thankfully, Cragtop didn't take a daily paper, but the Friday delivery filled a whole bag. There'd be at least 40 items, sometimes many more. The delivery was made up of such a variety of papers, magazines and more that Albert often found himself stopping to look as he packed them. Some were regulars. From Fleet Street came every issue of the Times. From Scotland came the Herald, Monday, Wednesday and Friday. From Manchester, the Manchester City News. Occasionally the front pages of these newspapers, with stories of the situation in Europe, caught his attention, but he was too jittery to stay distracted for long. Along with the nationals, there were a load of local papers with articles about lads joining up, gossip about members of the parish, and notices that surely had no meaning to anyone but the people who lived there. Albert had often wondered what it was that made these papers so interesting to the solitary owner of Cragtop. However, it was the odd assortment of magazines and pamphlets that unnerved him. Each week there would be a handful, their subject matter hinting at mysterious things quite out of place with Albert's world. Archaeological Journals detailed discoveries of ancient tombs. Badly printed newsletters from obscure societies with articles that were even stranger. Some were so worn by their journeys they were falling apart. Most Albert couldn't open, they were sealed in brown paper. But many of these had the name of the sender on the reverse. Even the names seemed scary. The Society of Light from the Silver Dagger, Journal of the Flowered Knife. They made him think about folk tales he'd occasionally heard from old men in the village. Once, in late November, a small white booklet had arrived. It was not in an envelope, but instead the pages were glued together and would need a paper knife to separate them. The booklet's title was fixed to the front cover just below an address label. On Controlling Fiends and Monsters. He'd shown his father, who'd smirked and cuffed him on the back of the head. All that mattered as far as his father was concerned was that a man paid his bills and kept a civil tongue in his head. And there, the master of Cragtop was faultless. Albert glanced across at his father, stern-faced as he busied himself with an early customer. He stuffed the last of the papers into the bag. It wouldn't do to be here when his father was done. He was very free with his cuffs. Albert pulled the bag onto his shoulder and headed out into the cold. He turned left and began to trudge through the snow towards the outskirts of the village. He didn't know much about the owner. Cragtop was perched high on the rocks a few miles from the village. It had always seemed to attract strangers. Like his predecessors, the current owner had been the subject of village gossip when he arrived in 1911. He lived alone, apart from an elderly manservant, and had made no attempt to befriend the locals in the 3 years since. There'd been wild stories about him from the villagers. "I hear he mined in Africa," Thomas had said, buying tobacco in the crowded shop one morning. "Got rich finding diamonds on land he stole from the Boers." "He's the mark of a slave trader if you ask me," old Clem had replied. Old Clem had once been to sea, and so considered himself an authority on most things beyond the village. "It's in the eyes. I saw 'em all over in the old days, horrible buggers." Like anything fresh, though, eventually he had become old news, and the villagers had found other things to talk about. On the rare occasions he was seen in the village, people would nod politely and perhaps mention that they'd seen him. But other than that, no one much cared. Albert cared, though. The owner of Crag Top was a wizard.
Teddy, Is this what we made? Yes, this is part of the beginning. The beginning. Teddy, Edward Bear, tell me, straight out, is there a chance we could all get home? All get home? Edward echoed her on a question, and he stressed the all. Em's heart seemed to drop. We aren't all here. How long have you been looking for me, Ted? And who else? Hurry, Emily, Dee, we have a train to catch. Hand in hand they walked down the vaulted marble halls, and now Em knew where she was. This was the underground railway system that would rival Moscow's for grandeur and beauty. This was central. In time it was planned that it would link with the furthest outposts of the world. It had spread way beyond the utopian dreams of its designers. I've got food and water from the canteen, said Ted. He handed them each water bottles and packets. But Ted, they'll feed us on the train, won't they? The trains were to be like the Orient Express in its heyday, and everything first class. Everyone deserves first class, Papa had said. Well, that was the plan. Now, Edward was right, as usual. It would be a long, long journey, and water only seemed to come in bottles. What had the cleaners been using? She wondered vaguely. Perhaps floors didn't get very dirty now there were no shoppers to tread on them. But all that was fading, and a lot of things were coming back to her. You wouldn't have needed provisions to get from Central to Greystones at one time. It was a short journey then. Edward, when did we lose each other? Em stopped, because it seemed to her that in the dim, distant past, which was also the future, it was she who had left them. How long had they been trying to reach her before she turned back and found them? But they came to the platform before she could catch and hold the thought. It was a horror. It was dark and shadowy and vast. Now populations of cities could have waited here. Ted pulled them briskly along, making no attempt to answer Em's gabbled questions. He was rushing them down to the left, away from the dark depths, where, vaguely in the distance, Em could see a group of passengers? Passengers? But if they were passengers, weren't they also shoppers? She felt a chill of horror run down to her toes. They must be warned. Maybe they could get near enough to shout. Ted! It was hard to get her breath, her legs now too short to keep up with Teddy's sturdy ones. Ted! Shoppers ahead! I saw... They got hold of him. 2 of them, one on each side. It's okay, said the voice of Edward Bear. They are passenger persons. Passenger persons? But, Eddie, why would they make passenger persons? What would they be for?